if we look at catchment hydrology, if we're interested in catchment hydrology, what we really have to be interested in, first of all, is the water cycle. So when we look at the water cycle, there's a couple of key issues here that come out of that water cycle when we sort of look and try to understand what's happening in the water cycle. First of all, the water cycle is closed. So we don't have water moving or being generated in the water cycle. We have water that's just moving around in the system. So it may evaporate in a large surface water body. It may fall as rain. It generates runoff. Some of it goes to infiltration. Some of it goes to evapotranspiration. Some of it goes to groundwater. And groundwater will discharge back into the surface water system. So what we have is a natural closed system. But I think probably the most important thing to notice about this picture is the fact that groundwater and surface water, that the boundaries between groundwater and surface water are very gray. There is no clear, distinct boundary between groundwater and surface water. It's really one water. And the water is moving within all these different processes inside that water cycle. And we talk about groundwater and surface water separately, not because they're really separate in nature, but because historically we have managed groundwater and surface water separately. Institutionally, we have groundwater is in one institution and surface water management is in another institution, primarily because surface water was managed historically for flooding purposes, and groundwater was managed, if it was managed at all, it was managed for water supply. So the key messages here is that the water cycle is closed, and that the boundaries between groundwater and surface water are indistinct, and in fact they're artificial. They're artificial from a management point of view from a historical basis. Now that picture we saw previously is very much a pristine natural system, but the real system is much more complex. And the reason it's more complex primarily is because we have people using the water. We have people actually doing something to the water and changing the way that water cycle functions. And if we actually look at the the users in the system, then we can broadly define them into three different groups of users. We have agricultural users, where each farmer on his own is only using a small amount of water. But collectively, all the farmers together use a vast amount of water. Maybe 60, 70, 80% of our water budget, of our water resources, are used in the agricultural sector. That can contrast then to the urban, the industrial, the mining users, and that sort of thing, where we're actually using a lot of water, not as much as the agricultural sector, but it's very focal. It's used in a very localized sense, so that the impacts locally are very high, but maybe as a total consumption, it's not as high as the agricultural sector. So we talk about point source impacts. On the other hand, there is the environmental sector. And the environmental users are really the trees, and the fish, and the biota, and the rest of the ecology of the system, which is primarily in either the surface water system or on the land surface itself. And the environment uses water. We have to be aware of that. Trees will take water from groundwater, they will take water from the unsaturated zone. Eucalypts have been called wooden pumps, simply because they pump water from the groundwater and basically put it into the atmosphere. If we look at these users then, and we sort of think about this for a moment and say, well, if a water user is using water, consuming water, but the water cycle is closed, what do we really mean by water use? Well, one definition, or a couple of definitions that I like to see, or I can sort of speak to me, are this idea that water use is really moving water between storages. So if we take water from the groundwater and we apply it on the farm fields as irrigation, then we're basically moving it from a groundwater storage to maybe a surface water storage, or even an atmospheric storage, if we're changing evapotranspiration. We can also consider use as a way of preventing a competing use. Maybe we add something to the water, we change its temperature, or we change its properties in some way. If we look though at the use on a catchment scale, the use primarily within the catchment stays within the catchment. except for evapotranspiration. If we change evapotranspiration, then we export water out of the catchment, because it rarely rains in the same catchment where you have the evapotranspiration occurring. Now, if we look at, take a picture of a surface water system now, what we see is we see a river. And that river can vary in width, but it can have a variation of velocity along its length. But by and large, we can go to that river, that surface water system, and we can measure. We can measure the velocity in the stream. We can measure the width of the cross-section. We can measure the depth in the stream. We can jump across it if it's not so wide. You know, we can basically put our hand in the water and we can feel it and we can understand what's happening in the surface water system. We can conceptualize that system very well. If we look at the groundwater system, on the other hand, the groundwater system is much more complex in the sense that we cannot measure, we cannot feel the groundwater part. Because when we look at the groundwater system, we have to put a borehole in the system. And that borehole is a point measurement. And we maybe have several boreholes in the system, and we have to infer or interpolate what happens between those boreholes, or what the system is like between those boreholes. So we don't really know what's happening in the groundwater system. On the other hand, there's also a time scale difference here. We can have a shallow groundwater system, maybe close to these streams, where we have infiltration close to the streams, and that infiltration will discharge into the stream over a period of a few days or a few weeks. But we may have recharge up here in the highlands that will discharge into a large surface water body, maybe an ocean or a big lake or even a big river, but that may take years to discharge there, or decades, hundreds of years, or in some cases even thousands of years. So that the time scales here in the groundwater system are vast, or can be vast, but they actually span a very large range. And we have to understand that range of processes, that time scales, if we want to understand the way groundwater and surface water interact. So the messages here then are that surface water has a human scale. It's something that we can feel and we can relate to. And it can be characterized and understood in a way that groundwater cannot. Because groundwater is inherently indeterminate. We cannot really, we can understand it conceptually, but we can't really get in and feel it and understand it the same way as we can surface water. And finally, the groundwater operates at a time scale that we can't really relate to. Decades or hundreds of years is something that on our time scale of a human lifetime is actually is very difficult to comprehend. Now, when we're thinking about surface water, the way surface water gets its water is from a process, often from a process what we call runoff. And that is really this idea that there's a rapid response in the stream or in the river in response to rainfall. And that runoff, or what we call runoff, then is a function primarily of the land surface. So land use, vegetation, soil type, the topography, the elevation, the slope, and all these sorts of things contribute to that process that we call runoff. Now, the other contributing process to runoff is the meteorology. If it rains a lot, rains very hard, very intense, we'll get more runoff than if it rains slowly over a long period of time. So 100 millimeters over 2 days will have more infiltration, and more runoff, or less runoff, than 100 millimeters in an hour. Likewise, if it rained yesterday and the soil is saturated, then 100 millimeters of rain will actually generate more runoff than if it was being 100 millimeters after a long drought. So the meteorology and the way that plays together is an important part of the runoff process. However, if we look at runoff is what happens when it rains. But the other thing that happens when it rains is that water infiltrates, when water evaporates. And so really, the processes here that define runoff, or that help us in terms of understanding runoff, are exactly the same processes and parameters that actually affect evapotranspiration and infiltration. Because there's only really 3 things that can happen to rain. When it rains, it infiltrates, it runs off, or it evaporates. And when we build a surface water model, we use runoff as the boundary condition. And so what we do is we assume something about infiltration, NET. And when we build a groundwater model, we use recharge or infiltration as the boundary condition. So we're assuming something about runoff and evapotranspiration. And if you get a groundwater modeler together with a surface water modeler and try to do the same model in the same catchment, they will argue about those assumptions, because they will make different assumptions, and they won't come to an agreement very easily. So if you have a fully integrated coupled groundwater surface water model, what the model is really doing is it's partitioning rainfall into those three components internally. It's partitioning rainfall into infiltration, runoff, and evapotranspiration. So it's doing that on an internal basis in the model. So you don't have to make assumptions like you would do if you were doing a surface water model or a groundwater model separately. Now, if we actually want to build a model of a system like this, we can start with the groundwater system, and we can build up the hydrogeology, and we can define some sort of boundary conditions for that groundwater model. But the primary boundary condition for the groundwater model is groundwater recharge. We have to define how much water is entering the groundwater system at the groundwater table. If we want to add in the surface water system, then we have to define some water levels in the river and some connection between the surface water system and the groundwater system via some sort of a stream that conducts of some sort. But the primary boundary condition for the groundwater is still groundwater recharge. If we were to add an unsaturated zone into this system, an unsaturated zone model, then we move up in the soil system, or conceptually in the processes, and now our boundary condition becomes net infiltration. And net infiltration then typically being the amount of water that comes out of the bottom of the root zone and then infiltrates eventually down to the groundwater table. But if we add the land surface to this model, then all of a sudden we can use reference evapotranspiration as the boundary condition. And we can use rainfall as the boundary condition. Well, interestingly, we can measure rainfall. And we can measure reference evapotranspiration. So suddenly we're up to a process that's actually measurable. We cannot measure groundwater recharge. We cannot measure infiltration. We can really only measure reference evapotranspiration and rainfall. They have errors in those measurements, but we can quantify those errors, and thus quantify the uncertainty associated with those errors, or with those measurements. It's very difficult to quantify the error in groundwater recharge, because it's something that's inherently not knowable. So, if we're building a fully integrated catchment model, or a fully integrated hydrologic model of a system, what we're doing is we're internalizing the traditional boundaries of a surface water model and a groundwater model. We're letting the model calculate those boundary conditions, and we're using the model to relate external inputs into those internal boundary conditions. The other thing that we do with a catchment model like this then is that we're actually moving the boundary conditions away from our process of interest. When I started learning about groundwater modeling, the first thing that you learn is you move your physical boundaries far away from your area of interest. You don't want your fixed head boundary close to your pumping wells. But we didn't really talk ever about process boundaries, because groundwater recharge is a really hard boundary for a groundwater model. And when we move these boundary conditions further away in terms of processes, we're making sure that the boundary conditions don't affect our area of interest or our process of interest as much. Now, if we look at actually the parameters that come into a model, because every time we add a process, we need more parameters. And when we look at the parameters in the model, and we relate those parameters, in this case, to stream flow, which parameters of our model will affect the calculated stream flow in rivers and streams? Well, If we look at a complex model with multiple layers in the subsurface, then the parameters, the parameter that affects, or one of the parameters that affects stream flow is stream bed leakage. That's no surprise. So the rate at which water will come out of the stream and into the ground, into the groundwater surface. Also the drainage constant of our drains. So how easy it is for groundwater to get into the drainage network. Those are important parameters that affect stream flow, calculated stream flow in our models. But what's interesting though here is that in this example anyway, the parameter that has the largest impact on stream flow is actually the hydraulic conductivity of the superficial groundwater system. So the superficial groundwater system is actually driving stream flow in this case. But what do we know about superficial groundwater? Nothing. Because when we actually do groundwater borings, when we bore holes in the groundwater and actually measure groundwater levels, we typically measure deep groundwater levels. Because that is the area of interest for us. We're actually pumping, we're using deep groundwater for irrigation or water supply or something like that. We typically do not measure very much in the shallow groundwater system. But our stream flow is actually able to quantify the shallow groundwater system. So if we look at the groundwater system though, and the parameters that affect groundwater levels, and this is what we're actually measuring in this system. We're measuring groundwater levels. But those groundwater levels are measured based on the deep borings. And so not surprising, the groundwater levels in our model are controlled by the properties of the deeper groundwater system. So we see then here is that the deepest groundwater levels are what controls the calculated groundwater levels. The shallow groundwater properties do not affect groundwater levels. What they affect is flow into the streams. So the message here is that if a fully integrated catchment model, a fully integrated model of the catchment processes, actually is more robust because it brings together all these processes. And if you want to calibrate a catchment model that includes all these processes, it's many times easier to calibrate because it has to actually fit together like a puzzle in order to make it work. And then when it fits together like that, you end up with a more robust model because the model is glued together in a way that has to work in order for it to properly calibrate and for it to actually give you good results. So what we have then is we have this process called integrated hydrology, which sort of brings together in a holistic sense all of these different processes in the catchment. And Mike Shee is a modeling framework that allows you to sort of try to bring all that together into one modeling system. It includes precipitation and snowmelt, which it includes vegetation-based evapotranspiration, so the calculation of actual evapotranspiration based on vegetation distributions and properties. Unsaturated groundwater flow, saturated groundwater flow, flow in the channels and rivers and streams, surface flow and flooding on your floodplains, demand-driven irrigation, so if you're doing scenarios, it will apply irrigation if the plants need water, and only during the periods of time when the plants need water. And then integrated water quality amongst all those different processes. Now, Mike Shee was originally conceived as a physics-based approach to integrated catchment modeling. So you were looking at conservation of mass and momentum between all of these different processes. But in fact, that's often it's not needed. Often there's not enough data for that. So over the last number of years, what we've driven for in terms of Mike Shee is to keep it practical, in the sense that where we don't have as much data, or we don't have as much time to do the calculations, that we use simpler numerical methods for these different processes. So you can use a lump conceptual groundwater model when you don't have any data. You can use simpler unsaturated zone methods when you don't have time to calculate detailed unsaturated flow. There are different ways of calculating the surface water flow. If you have a 30-year simulation for water resources management, you don't care what happens in the river every 2 minutes. So you use a simpler river model. Likewise, if you're simulating an event, a storm event or something, the groundwater model doesn't need to be as complicated because nothing happens in the groundwater in a week. Groundwater is something that changes slowly over a period of months and years. So what Mike Shih is it is a framework for hydrologic modeling. It's no longer a single numerical method. It's a way of actually holistically building a model that suits the purpose and the reason that you're building the model for. So that you can guide the modeling strategy and the modeling framework into the way that you want to, what the results you want to get out of that model. So if we look at Mike Shih as a framework for modeling, and we can build these models, what kind of outputs can we expect out of a model like this? I mean, the traditional output from a groundwater model is basically groundwater flow or groundwater elevations, which is obviously something you can get out of this because it has a groundwater component. But we can also look at surface flooding. So in this case, the depth of water on the ground surface. And if this is a surface, this is a wetland model in southern Florida, we can then start to look at hydro periods. How many days of the year is this area flooded? What is the flood extent over a period of time? What is the surface area flooded as a function of time in the model, for example? We can also look at water quality. In this case, in this particular model, this is a model in Denmark, we're looking at nitrogen concentrations, simulated nitrogen concentrations in this fjord here behind. But one of the most important outputs from an integrated catchment model is real water budgets. And the real water budgets is important because it really allows you to understand what is happening in your system. So that you have precipitation. And what fraction of that precipitation goes to evapotranspiration? What fraction goes to groundwater storage? What fraction goes to base flow to a river? And trying to pull apart all these different components of your water budget. We can do a water budget on the whole catchment. We can do it on a sub-catchment. We can do it on a small area. And we can get all of these water budgets in terms of time series too. How does the summer water budget relate to the winter water budget? And how does that water budget vary over time in terms of base flow to my river, for example? So all of these components are available and can easily be extracted from the model because the model includes all of the relevant processes. Another good example here is a model that was done in Ontario, Canada, where you can see the stream. And this is actually discharged to the surface. And the stream is a river in the model, that's fine. But what's more interesting is that these areas along here that are actually discharging are high ET areas. Because that's where the floodplain, the highlands, comes down and comes into the floodplain. And those are actually discharge areas then, groundwater discharge areas that have a high evaporative load. If an ET is very high in those areas, simply because of the changes in topography, not because there's a stream there. But because you've got the surface system modeled correctly, you can actually pick up those areas on the map. And you can quantify the amount of ET that's being generated or being used, how much water is being used in those areas, and how does that part contribute to the overall catchment water balance. And the fact is that this map, this is only one snapshot. This is one picture. That map will change over the course of the year. So groundwater discharge areas today may be groundwater recharge areas tomorrow. And we can see that in the next picture here, where we're actually mapping here in the same model basically wetland areas. And you can see that in the wet season, this wetland here actually maps very, very well onto this, what's pictured here as a wetland. But in fact, in the summer period, when it's dry, we see that it's not really all a wetland anymore. And in fact, these areas here actually become recharge areas. So that if it rains in the summer, these are recharge areas. And so there's a complete switch from a discharge to a recharge area over the course of the seasons. And the seasonal change. And you can pick that up and capture that then in a fully integrated catchment model that includes land surface processes and evapotranspiration properly in the model. Now, if we want to come back and look at something just briefly about flooding, and flooding is in fact a very important recharge process. So when our streams and rivers flood on an annual basis, they actually generate a significant amount of recharge in the floodplain, which sustains streams over the dry season. Because this water, when it recharges here, will actually take many weeks or months for that to get back into the river system. And so that when we can simulate flooding in a model, then we can also simulate then the impact of that flooded recharge of those flooded areas on the groundwater system and on the surface water system over a period of a long period of time. So this is actually a Mike flood model of an urban area, and this is another Mike flood model. Now, one last example of a Mike Sheen model where flooding is actually plays a critical role is an example in the Big Cypress Basin in Florida, where we're looking at looking at trying to map out land use changes and how they affect flooded areas, because this is what we're trying to do, is restore wetland in these areas. And so basically, is trying to find out how do we enhance the hydro periods in this sort of flooded area here, while still maintaining dry areas and other areas that have agricultural components to them. And so the idea then here is to use an integrated approach to actually map groundwater onto flooding events and groundwater flooding and these sorts of processes. Now, one other little topic that I'd like to mention on before I finish here is Ecolab. And Ecolab is an equation solver that's part of the Mike by DHI ecosystem, if you like. And it's an equation solver that allows you to solve differential equations where some of the inputs come from the hydrodynamic models or the hydrologic models. Some of the inputs can come from the advection dispersion components, so the solute concentrations, if you like. And you can use Ecolab then for generating other outputs, or for affecting back into the solute, the advection dispersion modeling. Without getting into too many specifics, one example of an Ecolab model that doesn't relate to water quality, but also doesn't relate to the way the model is not a typical output from the model, is this idea of something that was done in England last year, was looking at using Ecolab to map hazard areas for flooding. In the UK, they've got this simple little formula for hazard rating, where you've got the depth of water during the flood, the velocity of the water, and then some debris factor, which is really just some sort of a step function. If the depth is greater than something, then the debris factor comes into play. And based on this simple flood hazard model, you can actually generate a time-varying map of where the flood is dangerous and not. And so you can actually get a map now of looking at, well, you better get out of the way down here because that's where you're liable to get into trouble if you're down there during the flood. And this map, it'll be a time-varying map that will actually vary and change during the course of the flood. Now, this may not be very relevant. This example isn't directly relevant, but it illustrates a way that you can generate indexes based on hydrological inputs. So you could generate indexes for ecological function. You could generate indexes for, species and stuff like that within your system. If the depth of the water table is below a certain depth, and you've got this much rain, and you've got et cetera, then you can generate maybe an index for some sort of a habitat, for example, in a catchment, or the suitability for species within your catchment. Now, generally speaking, when we're talking about Mike Sheen, what we're talking about is a model that couples groundwater and surface water. So when surface water and groundwater both play a role. Typical example is in wetlands, wetland management, wetland restoration, all these sorts of things. Or when groundwater and surface water need to be managed as a team. So when you pump groundwater and you're conjunctively using surface water at the same time. Climate change and land use change are inherently surface processes. it's very difficult to relate climate change to groundwater recharge. Because climate change will affect temperature, but it will affect wind speed and solar radiation and all these other different processes that affect evapotranspiration. And so, and how do we relate then changes in evapotranspiration to groundwater recharge on a spatial basis? Irrigation management, drought and flood planning, all of these things are actually important components that can be addressed, or important problems that can be addressed with a model like Mike Sheet. Environmental flows and environmental reserves. Classic examples of where Mike Sheet can really make a difference. But basically what we're doing is we're building and we're using Mike Sheet models wherever surface processes affect groundwater and vice versa. Now, integrated models on their own are not a silver bullet. Integrated models are important, are very important tools in our toolkit, if you like. But in order to be useful, and when they are useful, they will be useful whenever surface water impacts groundwater subsurface conditions. But in order to be useful, the models themselves and the tools for making these models have to be practical and they have to be robust. Which means you have to have a user interface that will allow you to actually build these models quickly and effectively. When we're building these models, we will have to make compromises. Because compromises is all about making engineering decisions. We don't want a model that's scientifically correct, we want a model that's practical. That gives us conceptually the general feeling for how the system behaves, and then we can go on and make decisions from there. Because we're actually calibrating these models and we're using effective parameters. A flooding model will use different parameters than a water resources management model. It comes back to this fit for purpose. The models have to be designed and developed for the reason we built it. But the model in the end has to be just good enough to make a decision. And then we can build some more knowledge in the system and move on forward from there. Because there is no perfect model. There's no perfect modeling tool, and there's no perfect model that you actually develop. You want the simplest model that will allow you to make a decision, but no simpler, to paraphrase Albert Einstein. And we want to use that model and update the model continuously so that we can, as more data becomes available and more understanding, and as we generate more understanding in the system, that the model becomes a repository for that data and that understanding. We don't want certainty from models. We want engineering confidence to make decisions. And we make decisions stepwise. We're a bit more confident now so we can make a step in our decision making. And then as we gather more data, we verify the model, we can make further decisions.